After being kept as Xiexin's caged bird for 5 years, he was finally about to get married. Just when I thought I could take the generous severance package and leave with dignity, Xiexin, that bastard, demanded that I continue being his mistress in secret. Could anyone be more despicable? On the day of Xiexin's engagement, I snuck into the venue. The city's most luxurious hotel's grand banquet hall was bustling with elegantly dressed guests and glamorous lights. I was clad in thrift shop attire that screamed out of place, but the invitation in my hand ensured I was allowed in. The person Xiexin was engaged to was named Ran Anren. I had never seen her before, nor had I heard of her name. It was through the murmured conversations of 2 nearby guests that I learned the Ren family owned the largest luxury goods company in a neighboring city. Ran Anren was the quintessential wealthy heiress. Looking up, I saw her clinging affectionately to Xiexin's arm one moment, and Xiexin holding her waist protectively the next. The man was tall and striking, the woman delicate and elegant, a picture-perfect couple. Seemingly sensing my presence, Xiexin suddenly glanced in my direction. Tilting my head, I flashed him a cheeky wave and smile. Xiexin's expression remained unchanged, not a single flicker of emotion in his features. Yet somehow, I could tell he wasn't pleased. So I grinned even wider. Xiexin signaled his secretary with a glance, and then resumed mingling with the crowd. His secretary, catching the cue, approached me promptly. Bowing slightly, he spoke politely. "Miss Su, let me escort you back." 5 years ago, Jiangxi was at Xiexin's beck and call, and 5 years later, nothing had changed. How dull. I tossed the piece of cake in my hand and brushed off the crumbs. I hadn't come to make trouble. Receiving the invitation, I had simply wanted to see if Xiexin was truly getting married and to whom. Now that I'd seen it all, it was time to leave. Just as I reached the entrance to the banquet hall, I felt a gaze boring into my back. Turning around, I realized it was Ran Anren. The girl's skin was pale, her features delicate, and she was staring at me with an unblinking gaze. Her expression lacked the curiosity or probing one might expect upon seeing me, and there was no contempt or disdain either. The emotions one might feel upon discovering her fiancé's mistress. Her calm gaze was unnervingly striking. Suddenly, a memory from years ago surfaced in my mind. A torrential rainstorm, as if it could drown the entire city. Someone in all black, holding a large black umbrella, stood silently in the rain. Behind her was a solemn mourning hall, the cries of grief piercing through the rain. Her eyes were fixed on me, brimming with hatred, as if she wanted to tear me to pieces. Because of my little escapade, Xiexin tightened his control over me again. No going out, no running around. My movements were confined to the villa's extensive grounds. Calling it extensive is an understatement. When the property was first sold, it was dubbed the crown jewel of the development. A 7-story retro-style townhouse, complete with a lush, sprawling garden spanning over 2,000 square meters. In the mornings, I could take leisurely strolls through the garden for over an hour without retracing my steps. 100 staff members, including maids, bodyguards, and cleaners, catered to me alone. If I was hungry, someone would cook. If I was cold, someone would bring me a coat. If I was tired, someone would prepare my bed. A life that many could only dream of. But being trapped here, isolated from the world, for 5 years straight, it was pure torment. The bodyguards, under strict orders, followed me like shadows. In the past, I would rage and resist, lashing out at them with words and fists. But after Xiexin beat a bodyguard half to death in front of me for upsetting me, I stopped resisting. Xiexin wouldn't lay a hand on me, but he had no qualms about making others suffer. Every act of rebellion from me was a disaster for these ordinary people. The sun was shining brightly, and I was lazily swinging on a garden swing. The purple leaf plums had bloomed with the arrival of spring, their delicate white flowers layering over the vibrant red leaves like clouds brushing against the spring breeze. A butterfly carefully landed on one blossom, only to be startled by approaching footsteps. It fluttered its wings and took off into the distance. I watched it fly away, filled with envy for its freedom. But, of course, the infuriating and utterly tone-deaf Xiaoshen didn't care about the mood. He walked over and gave the swing a gentle push, breaking the stillness. "Why were you at the engagement party that day?" he asked curtly. The union between the Xia and Ren families had been a meticulously guarded secret, hidden from me entirely. Given my confinement, I wasn't supposed to know about it, let alone appear at the event. I turned my gaze away. Someone sent me an invitation. Who? How would I know? Xiaoshen's eyes darkened as he stared at me. I stared back, unflinching. The invitation had been left on my swing. I had no idea who placed it there, or how they managed to get it to me. Xiaoshen had interrogated all the staff in the villa and even reviewed the surveillance footage. He must have found nothing, which was why he had come to question me again. After a moment, Xiaoshen's gaze softened. He gently pushed the swing again and said in a coaxing tone, "I'll figure it out. Just stay put and don't wander off." I let out a cold snort but didn't bother to reply. That night, Xiaoshen stayed over at the villa. We sat across from each other at the dining table. Watching him cut his steak leisurely, I couldn't help but ask, confused, "Don't you need to be with your fiancé?" Without even looking up, Xiaoshen replied, "No." His impenetrable demeanor irritated me to no end. I put down my knife and fork, staring at him. "You're getting married soon. Let's end this improper relationship now." After a moment, I added, "It'll be better for both of us." Xiaoshen's movements paused. He looked up at me. His gaze was deep, like a bottomless pool, brewing with an impending storm. "Impossible. Su Xingran, don't even think about it." His words were slow and deliberate, every syllable laced with a biting intensity. Perhaps as punishment for daring to think of leaving, Xiaoshen was especially relentless that night. He manipulated me into whatever position he liked. Tears streamed from my eyes as he pushed me to my limits. Unwilling to yield, I bit his shoulder fiercely. When the taste of blood filled my mouth, I softened, slowly releasing him. I called his name, my voice muffled with choked sobs. "Xiaoshen, Saisen, Saisen." Over and over, my words carried fragments of despair and vulnerability. He lowered his head, kissing my forehead repeatedly, gently wiping away my tears as if handling a priceless treasure. "I'm here. Ran, don't be scared." Exhausted, I closed my eyes. "Xiaoshen, let me go." His body stiffened but soon retaliated fiercely, as if he hadn't heard a word. When it was over, he held me in his arms. Half asleep, I heard him say, "I'm leaving for a business trip to Singapore tomorrow. Be good and wait for me at home." I didn't respond. Knowing I wasn't asleep, Xiaoshen didn't press me. Instead, he gently smoothed the stray hairs by my temple, his voice softening further. "What do you want as a gift? I'll bring it back for you." Whether it was a newly launched designer item, million-dollar jewelry, or some privately owned treasure, Xiaoshen could present anything I desired. He could give me everything, except freedom. Turning away, I ignored him and drifted off to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, Xiaoshen was already gone. I changed out of my nightgown and pulled open the curtains. Sunlight streamed in, revealing the lush garden outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The bodyguards watched me closely every day, but they would relax slightly whenever Xiaoshen stayed over. It was my only chance. I opened the window, jumped out, and started running. Through the garden, over the fence. When I landed, the sharp edges of the fence tore a gash into my calf, blood immediately flowing out, but I didn't dare stop. An alarm blared behind me. It was the villa staff realizing I was gone. The entire property was covered in surveillance cameras. Avoiding them all was impossible. Being discovered was just a matter of time. I limped forward, determined to get farther away. Maybe fate took pity on me. A taxi appeared in the distance. This area, populated by the wealthy, rarely saw taxis. Without hesitation, I flagged it down. The driver, a kind-hearted man, noticed the wound on my leg and asked if I needed to go to the hospital. I shook my head. Take me to the beach. I couldn't truly escape this place. When Xie Shen first confined me, I tried countless times to flee. Morning, night, dawn, whenever an opportunity arose, I seized it without hesitation. The most successful attempt was boarding a plane, thinking I'd left for good. But the moment the plane landed, Xie Shen was waiting for me at the airport. Afterward, he took away my ID card, passport, and even my household registration book. Without these, the only option was buses that didn't require identification. Yet when that bus wobbled its way to the final stop, there he was again, waiting. He was powerful and resourceful, and I was helpless and alone. No matter how far or near I ran, Xie Shen always caught me with ease. This time was no different. Barely off the taxi, a fleet of cars roared toward me. Jiang Shi led the group of over 30 men. Xie Shen had 3 secretaries, each responsible for different matters. Jiang Shi was the one I interacted with most, and we knew each other's temperaments well. He didn't persuade me to go back, and I didn't demand they leave. The morning sun shimmered on the sea, its surface sparkling. A gentle ocean breeze brushed past, as if soothing all my troubles and worries with the sound of waves. I kicked off my shoes, sinking my feet into the sand, savoring this fleeting moment of freedom. It wasn't until nightfall that Xie Shen arrived. The flight to Singapore took over 6 hours. No amount of power or wealth could make a plane turn back midair. Likely, he received the news upon landing and immediately boarded the next flight back, his entire appearance disheveled. He'd been traveling all day, yet didn't seem angry. Silently taking the medical kit Jiang Shi handed him, he pulled me to sit on a rock. Kneeling on one knee, he began tending to my wound. Despite his cold, icy expression, his movements were gentle. Xie Shen, I'll keep running. You can't keep me here. It was blatant defiance. Xie Shen acted as though he hadn't heard me. When he finished treating my injury, he passed the kit to Jiang Shi and extended his hand toward me. Ran, let's go home. In his eyes, tiny stars seemed to glimmer. My nose tingled, tears threatening to fall. Xie Shen, we can't go back anymore. I have known Xie Shen since we were little. To put it nicely, we are childhood sweethearts. To put it bluntly, I'm just the young maid, and he's the young master. My father is Xie Shen's father's personal chauffeur. Since I can remember, I've been living in the Xie household. My father always says that the Xie family is our benefactor and tells me to be sensible and obedient. So, from a very young age, I helped the chef uncle pick vegetables, helped the cleaning aunt mop the floors, and helped the gardener uncle trim the flowers. I was the ideal servant at the Xie family. Xie Shen's parents are both very kind and gentle people, and they treated us servants with great tolerance. The Xie family never had the bad habit of not allowing servants to be friends with the family, and since I was about the same age as Xie Shen, Madame Xie often had me stay and play with him. Over time, Xie Shen and I formed a small bond of friendship. I say it's small because Xie Shen was always busy. As the only child of the Xie family and the future heir to the company, he had to learn many things from a young age. Piano, Go, painting, golf. After finishing one thing, there was always another waiting for him. The first thing I realized as I grew older was that Xie Shen and I were from 2 completely different worlds. I kept to my role, maintaining a respectful distance from him. Until one winter when I was in my 3rd year of middle school, and it snowed for half a month. To save money, I took the bus to school every day. The bus could only take me to the foot of the hill where the villa was, and from there, I had to walk up a long, uphill road. The road was slippery because of the snow, and I slipped and fell. My knee hit a stone by the side of the road, and blood soaked my pants. I limped back to the Xie household, and it was already late at night. My father was still out attending a social event with Mr. Xie, and only Xie Shen was standing in the yard. Hearing footsteps, he turned around in a hurry and asked, "Why are you back so late?" Before he could finish his scolding, he saw my blood-soaked pants and immediately stopped, his eyes filled with clear concern and worry. That night, I experienced the thorough care of a family doctor. Later, when I went to high school, Xiaxin gave up his place at the elite school and chose to attend the public school where I was studying. When Madame Xia asked him why, I happened to be there. Xiaxin turned his head arrogantly, not looking at me, and said something irritating. "I want to experience the life of an ordinary person." I rolled my eyes, put down the fruit plate, and left the living room. In the end, Xiaxin really did attend the public school and ended up at the same school as me. We were in different classes and our interactions were few, but we were slowly drawing closer. As a private chauffeur, my father had to be at Mr. Xia's service all the time, and it was hard for him to balance his duties and take care of me. Since I was very young, I had to go to school and return home alone. Even parent-teacher meetings, my father missed them every time. I got used to it, but Xiaxin seemed to dislike it. He refused the chauffeur's rides and would follow me every morning to the foot of the hill, then take the bus to school with me. In the evenings, no matter how late class ended or how long I took to clean up, Xiaxin would always wait for me at the bus stop. On rainy or snowy days, the Xia family arranged for a chauffeur to pick me up, and I could take the car without feeling embarrassed, no longer enduring the cold and awkwardness of that snowy night. At the public school, Xiaxin was still outstanding, ranking first in every exam. Meanwhile, my grades started to drop rapidly at the competitive high school I transferred to. Seeing me sulking, Xiaxin offered to tutor me. Every evening after dinner, he would pull me into his study and teach me math and physics. Compared to the difficult knowledge, Xiaxin was really easy to understand. He was cold on the outside but warm on the inside, proud and awkward, with a sincere and soft heart. The tutoring continued for a whole year. After the second year of high school, when we had to choose between science and humanities, I decisively chose the latter. I returned to my comfort zone, but my relationship with Xiaxin could no longer go back to the clear boundaries of the past. We walked along the long hill road together, talking about our favorite movies and books. We skipped class to go to the beach, digging for seashells and childishly making wishes. We went to the amusement park, and when the roller coaster reached the highest point, we held hands tightly, screaming together. We grew closer and closer, and rumors about us spread more and more. Xiaxin was very popular at school, and many people knew his identity. My identity was no secret either. The harsh words like, "A toad wants to eat swan meat," "A fallen chicken wants to squeeze into a phoenix's nest," "Heaven's ambition but paper-thin fate," were always thrown at me. I didn't care, but Xiaxin couldn't stand it. At the senior class's swearing-in ceremony, he was the student representative giving a speech. After finishing his speech, he didn't leave the stage. Instead, he held the microphone and, in front of all the teachers and students, said, "There have been some rumors about me lately, and I'd like to clear them up." People around thought Xiaxin was going to distance himself from me, and they looked at me with glee. I looked up at Xiaxin, meeting his gaze, and saw his eyes filled with a smile. "I can't reach her, but I'm the one who's chasing after Su Xingran. It's one-sided, and I'm the one being one-sided with Su Xingran. As for the toad wanting to eat swan meat, I'm the toad." Every cruel word aimed at me was gently returned to him. Each word, tender yet firm. The students below were gossiping, and the homeroom teacher was desperately trying to get him off the stage, but Xiaxin didn't care. "Su Xingran, can you share which university you're planning to apply to?" "Where you go, I'll go." At that moment, he didn't shine with light, but in my youth, he shone brightly. Such a good Xiaxin, it was so easy for me to fall in love with him. But sadly, in the years that followed, hating him became just as easy. I spent the whole day at the beach, and as expected, I started running a fever. On my way home, I was spotted by Xiaxin. He took me to a private hospital and arranged for a special care room. After I was hooked up to N4, I pretended to be asleep and ignored him. Clearly, he didn't have time to keep an eye on me. He had missed an important business opportunity, and Mr. Xie called him in the middle of the night, scolding him harshly and ordering him to return home immediately. Xie Shun had no choice but to assign Jiang Shi to stay with me. Before he left, he touched my hot forehead and said, "I'll come see you tomorrow morning." The next day, I didn't get to see Xie Shun handling my discharge papers. Instead, I was greeted by Run Anren. Jiang Shi dutifully stood at the door, blocking Run Anren from coming in. The hospital room door was open, and Run Anren stepped around Jiang Shi to look at me. "Mrs. Xie heard you were sick. She couldn't come, so she asked me to visit." This private hospital was owned by the Xie family, so it wasn't surprising that Mrs. Xie knew about it. And the fact that Xie Shun had confined me was no secret to his parents. They knew full well, and they had sent numerous people to keep an eye on me, both openly and secretly. It was like that invitation that suddenly appeared in the courtyard. Xie Shun made a big deal out of investigating it, only to find nothing in the end. It probably led back to his parents, and he had to let it go quietly. I nodded at Jiang Shi, signaling him to let Run Anren in. Jiang Shi hesitated but obeyed. As soon as Run Anren entered, he quickly left to report to Xie Shun. With the bodyguard standing outside, the room was left with just me and Run Anren. If Mrs. Xie hadn't mentioned it, I wouldn't have known Xie Shun had a sister. She sat by the bed, a smile on her face. The next moment, seeing the nameplate at the head of the bed, she read aloud in surprise, "Su Xing Ran?" Her gaze sharpened with curiosity. I looked at her and replied, "We're not biological siblings. I'm just Mrs. Xie's goddaughter." Run Anren's expression grew complicated, her eyes hiding a mix of emotions. "Looks like the rumors are true, your father." She hesitated, but my memories suddenly unlocked, flooding me with painful recollections. 5 years ago, my father accidentally killed someone in a car crash. The Xie family had been in business for years, and though they had many rivals, they remained kind-hearted. Still, enemies emerged. Someone, seeking revenge, cut the brake line. After a late-night business meeting, my father was driving Mr. Xie home when he discovered the brakes had failed. In the ensuing panic, he hit a passerby and killed them. There was no denying it. My father was imprisoned. Mrs. Xie, feeling sorry for me, took me in as her goddaughter. This is the rumor Run Anren referred to, and also the official relationship between Xie Shun and me. I closed my eyes, my body trembling uncontrollably as I remembered my father. The courtroom was solemn, with the judge presiding from above. My father lowered his head, remorse in his eyes. "I plead guilty." I clutched the blanket tightly, shaking all over. "Xing Ran, are you okay?" Run Anren asked, reaching out to touch me, but I quickly dodged. A book slipped from my knee and fell to the ground. Run Anren bent down to pick it up and handed it back to me. After a while, I finally calmed down and Run Anren spoke. "I'm sorry." I looked at her, and for the first time, I saw genuine guilt in her eyes. "It's okay." I turned my gaze away, looking at the book that had been placed back on my lap, offering her the answer she wanted. The day of the accident was actually my birthday. Tears blurred the words on the pages as I choked up. He promised me he'd come back to have cake with me. When Xie Shun arrived, the hospital room was silent. Run Anren seemed to be skilled at changing her expressions. As soon as she heard footsteps, she immediately flashed a smile. She stood up and affectionately linked her arm with Xie Shun's, speaking in a coquettish tone. "Xie Shun, if Aunt hadn't mentioned it, I wouldn't have known you had a sister." Xie Shun allowed her to link arms with him, but his gaze fell on me. He inspected me from head to toe, as if making sure I wasn't injured or mistreated, then withdrew his gaze, giving Run Anren a nonchalant The atmosphere became noticeably cold, and I didn't bother to speak. However, Run Anren showed no sign of awkwardness. She turned to Xie Shun and suggested, "Xie Shun, aren't we still missing a bridesmaid for the wedding? How about we let Xing Ran be the bridesmaid?" Xie Shun immediately rejected without hesitation. "No." I interrupted him. "Sure. I flashed a big smile. I'm very happy to be your bridesmaid. Shen clearly disliked those titles, especially hearing them come from my mouth. He furrowed his brows and glanced at me, his gaze full of warning. But I wasn't afraid at all. Ren Anren, hearing this, let go of Shen and sat back down on the bed. Thank you, Xing Ran. My good friends got married early, so I have to trouble you. By the way, Xing Ran, do you have a boyfriend? I smiled and replied, no. Do you like anyone? I forced myself not to look at Shen, answering decisively, no. As soon as I finished speaking, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Ren Anren seemed to sense it, her eyes flickering with emotions, and she shifted the topic. After some more formal pleasantries, Shen could no longer bear it and politely asked Ren Anren to leave. Once she was gone, Shen immediately told me, Ren Anren is not simple, stay away from her. I shot back mercilessly. What good would it do to stay away from her? I should stay away from you. He looked like he hadn't slept all night, and after the previous day's flights, his eyes were bloodshot. Yet, his gaze toward me remained gentle and firm. Ran, I'm protecting you. I smiled bitterly and said nothing more. Shen was right. He was indeed protecting me. 5 years ago, my father accidentally killed someone in a car accident. The brake line was deliberately cut by someone, so it was classified as manslaughter. He turned himself in, and the Xie family helped pay a large sum of money as compensation to the victim's family. In the end, my father received only 10 years in prison. This outcome was the best for me, but completely unreasonable for the victim's family. Less than a year into his sentence, my father died in prison. The prison explained it as a suicide, but I knew he was forced to death. Those behind it could manipulate things in the prison with ease and easily retaliate against me. Using this as a pretext, Shen confined me. From then on, I was followed by a dozen bodyguards every moment, and I had to report to Shen wherever I went. I didn't want to live like this. I kept escaping, only to be caught and brought back by Shen each time. We tortured each other for 5 years. A page of the book on my lap was blown over by the wind, snapping me out of my thoughts.
I mettrai en before.
Shen looked puzzled. What? I raised my head to look at him. Not at the engagement banquet, but much earlier. Do you want to know? When I was in a relationship with Shen, I always liked to do things like this. Whenever something interesting came up or I heard some bizarre gossip, I'd throw out a little teaser to get Shen to guess. Shen spoiled me, always playing along. No matter how boring or irrelevant the topic was, he would patiently listen to me tell him everything. Shen's gaze grew distant for a moment, then softened, as though he too was reminiscing about the past. The person and the scenery remained the same, but our feelings had changed. He spoke in a slightly hoarse voice. I want to. I helplessly smiled and turned my head to look out the window, trying not to let it affect me. 5 years ago, at Lu Xinyan's funeral, I met Ren Anren. Lu Xinyan was the person my father accidentally killed in that car accident. I thought that once I realized Ren Anren's intentions were impure, Shen would reconsider the idea of the marriage. But 3 months later, Ren Anren confidently came to pick me up to try on dresses. If Shen wasn't afraid, I certainly wasn't. The wedding was being organized by a high-end private custom studio, and the venue was incredibly large. Shen and Ren Anren had already decided on their wedding outfits, and the designer had taken measurements and was working on them. The main purpose of today was to pick out my bridesmaid dress. As I looked at the rows of beautiful wedding gowns, I couldn't help but reflect. I had never believed in the fairy tale of Cinderella and the prince, but back then, I really did expect to marry Shen. Now, the man I wanted to marry is still by my side. But instead of a wedding dress, I was choosing a bridesmaid dress. Ren Anren had other motives, but she was still overly friendly toward me. Inside the ladies' fitting room, she pulled up the zipper for me, then crouched down to arrange the hem of the skirt. I couldn't help but laugh at the sight of this clumsy young lady, who clearly had never served others. Miss Ren, You don't need to try so hard to please me. Run Anren paused in her movements and stood up, her expression still composed. Sieshan values you, so naturally, I have to treat you well. Really? I couldn't be bothered to continue exchanging pleasantries with her. Do you really love Sieshan? What about Lucinian? I still couldn't forget the resentful look she gave me at Lucinian's funeral. She hated my father so much that she directed that hatred toward me as well. I noticed the fleeting pain in her eyes, so I continued. What was your relationship with Lucinian? Ren Anren shot back. I thought you would have asked what I wanted from getting close to Sieshan. I turned around indifferently and adjusted my dress in front of the mirror. Isn't it to take revenge on me? My father paid with his life. Isn't that enough? Do you want me to pay the price too? I said this casually, as if it were an unimportant matter. Ren Anren countered. No, I want to find out who the real killer is. At her words, I stiffened, and Run Anren's gaze met mine in the mirror. I saw an obsessive madness in her eyes, and in a panic, I turned away. My father is already dead. Ren Anren chuckled lightly and began answering my previous question. Sinian was my first love. He passed away when he was only 20, just as his life was about to begin. I closed my eyes, recalling the photo of the young man in the funeral home, forever frozen in black and white. My heart ached. I'm sorry. I apologized, but Run Anren seemed not to hear, continuing to reminisce about the past. Sinian came from an ordinary family, and no matter how unwilling we were, we had to accept the court's ruling with tears. But why was it that Sinian's life could be paid for with just 10 years of my father's sentence? I couldn't accept it. I hired someone to make your father suffer a bit in prison. I had never known about this part of the story. Prison visits were limited, and every time my father reported back, he only brought good news, never mentioning the struggles. I turned to look at Run Anren, and she smiled even brighter. It was just a lesson. No matter how powerful I am, I couldn't have had him killed in prison. The most I could do was have him beaten a few times. Her tone was light, not feeling at all guilty about her cruelty. I swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat and let out a cold laugh. People like you never value other people's lives. You're proudly boasting in front of a daughter about how you made her father suffer. My eyes stung, and Ren Anren suddenly said, Su Xingran, I didn't kill your father. When he first entered prison, I did have someone teach him a lesson, but he died more than half a year later. There's no reason why, during the time I was frequently troubling him, he would have fought to survive, and yet after I stopped, he suddenly committed suicide. He didn't die from my revenge. He was silenced by the real killer. Her few words were like a thunderclap in my ears, pulling me into the abyss of the past. I shoved Ren Anren aside and staggered toward the door. But my legs gave out, and I fell before I could reach it. Ren Anren came to help me, and my expression was laid bare before her. She was first puzzled, then shocked. Su Xingran, you knew already? You know who the killer is, don't you? You know, don't you? As she reached the truth, she could no longer maintain her composure. Hearing the noise, Sieshan rushed over, and Ren Anren seemed to have thought of something. She froze and stopped speaking. I grabbed Sieshan's arm. I'm tired. I want to go back. Without looking at Ren Anren, Sieshan picked me up in his arms. Ran, I'm sorry. Sia's family has been good to us. I'm doing this willingly. Don't blame anyone. Live your life well. But my poor Ran, you'll have to take care of yourself from now on. The night breeze rustled the curtains, and the soft moonlight occasionally spilled into the room. I huddled in the corner, replaying the contents of the recording pen over and over. The voice was weak, yet every word brimmed with love and reluctance. These were my father's last words to me. 5 years ago, on my 22nd birthday, Mr. Xie had specially given my father a day off. At the time, I had just graduated from college, started an internship, and was thrilled to receive my first paycheck. I took my father shopping, buying him new clothes. Father teased me, saying that it was my birthday, yet I was spending money on him instead. So I made my usual request. I asked him to buy me a cake. Despite our tight finances, my father never skimped on my birthdays. Each year, he'd spend a hefty amount to buy a beautiful cake. That year, it was my favorite chestnut cake. Back at home, we lit the candles, and my father insisted I make a wish. As I closed my eyes, his piercing ringtone interrupted the moment. Whatever was said on the other end drained the color from his face, and he turned to leave in a hurry. Dad. I chased after him in panic. Hearing me, he stopped, turned around, and looked at me with deep reluctance and worry in his eyes. His words came out jumbled. Dad has something urgent, something very urgent, and I need to leave. I nodded, and he turned to leave again. After taking a few steps, he paused, as if remembering something, and looked back with tears in his eyes. Ran, wait for me. We'll have the cake together when I get back. Anxiety filled my heart, but not wanting to worry him, I smiled and said okay. But instead of his return, I received news that he had run someone over and was taken away by the police. The accident happened on a secluded road without surveillance. My father turned himself in, and the case was quickly closed without much investigation. Yet, I noticed inconsistencies in the police's timeline. At the time of the accident, my father was clearly with me. When I pressed him for answers, he simply said, Ran, the Sieh family is our benefactor. Yes, the Sieh family was indeed our benefactor. Before we met them, we were just poor farmers in the mountains. My mother had passed away shortly after giving birth to me, and my father barely kept us alive by farming a small plot of land. But misfortune never spares the unfortunate. A torrential rain caused a landslide, burying our home and the season's harvest under mud. Sieh Corporation initiated a charity drive to aid in post-disaster rebuilding. Mr. Sieh himself came to the mountains, bringing us winter clothing and food supplies. Seeing our plight, he kindly offered my father a job as his personal driver. But my father couldn't even drive at the time. It was the Sieh family who paid for his driving lessons. Mr. Sieh took us out of the mountains, gave us a home, and even helped me enroll in school. These were debts we could never repay. The brake line was indeed cut intentionally. My father had been given the day off, and it was Mr. Sieh himself driving the car that day. It was Mr. Sieh who hit and killed Lu Sinian. But unwilling to bear the consequences, he called my father to the scene and removed the car's dashcam. He even colluded with the repair shop to claim the dashcam was malfunctioning and sent it off for repairs. My father voluntarily confessed, and the police didn't suspect anything, except for me and Sieh. I knew because my father was with me at the time. Sieh knew because his father had tasked him with handling the dashcam. Sieh was filled with guilt, but I didn't know how to face him. My father accepted it willingly, and I had no choice but to accept it too, waiting for my father's release. Each time I visited him, he asked if I was doing well, promising to make it up to me when he got out. But less than a year later, he was gone. Run Anran said she only acted out of anger, hiring people to teach my father a lesson in prison. But to a paranoid Mr. Sieh, such actions were like red flags signaling exposure. The once kind and genteel philanthropist had long vanished. Wealth had made him cling to life, and fame made him fear scandal. And only the dead could keep his secrets. So, he approached my father with a debt of gratitude, demanding repayment. My father, honest and stubborn, met with Mr. Sieh and, shortly after, slit his wrists with a broken shard of porcelain in prison. The guards found him and rushed him to the hospital. When I got the call, I hurried over, and with Sieh's help, I was allowed to see my father alone in his hospital room. At the time, I was working as a journalist and had been conducting an interview before rushing to the hospital. In my haste, I forgot to turn off my recording pen, inadvertently capturing my father's final words. Confessing to the crime was his choice. Ending his life to reassure Mr. Sieh was his choice too. My father repaid the Xia family's kindness with his life. Ren Anren was right, I knew everything. But there was nothing I could do. Xia Shen knew everything too. But he couldn't do anything either. I couldn't overlook gratitude. He couldn't forsake family. So, we tormented each other. Xia Shen protected me carefully, seemingly against vengeful family members. But in truth, it was his father he feared. He opposed his father for my sake, and I understood his struggles. Yet I still hated him and the Xia family. That was my father, my only family in the world. Xia Shen and Ren Anren's wedding was scheduled for the end of the year. I had reminded Xia Shen multiple times to be cautious of Ren Anren, but he seemed unconcerned. Instead, he enthusiastically brought me back to the same studio. This time, there was no discussion of dress styles. Measurements were taken directly. I didn't understand what Xia Shen was planning until the day of the wedding, when the dress was delivered to me. It could have easily been mistaken for a wedding gown. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with lifelike embroidered patterns, a long trailing skirt, and layers of fluffy lace that exuded ethereal elegance. Are you sure this is a bridesmaid's dress? Xia Shen smiled. Try it on. I hesitated, frowning at him. He relented. Ran, just listen to me, okay? After today, I'll let you go. Is that all right? I was stunned, staring at him, unable to discern anything from his expression. After changing into the dress, Xia Shen had also donned a groom's suit. A makeup artist came in to get me ready. Seeing us standing together, she complimented us, saying we were a perfect match and wished us a lifetime of happiness. I opened my mouth to refute, but Xia Shen beat me to it with a thank you. Unease began to well up in my heart, but no matter how much I asked, Xia Shen refused to explain. When everything was ready, he took my hand and led me into the banquet hall. The doors opened, and the screen on the stage began to play a slideshow of photos. They weren't wedding photos of Xia Shen and Ren Anren. They were candid shots of Xia Shen and me from when we were dating. The guests seated weren't business tycoons or old acquaintances of the Xia family. I recognized almost every face. Our classmates and teachers from high school and university, even a supervisor from my first year of work after graduation. I finally realized this wasn't Xia Shen and Ren Anren's wedding. This was the wedding Xia Shen had planned for him and me. Xia Shen. I turned to question him, but my gaze was caught by Ren Anren in the distance. She wasn't wearing a wedding dress. Instead, she was in casual attire, walking alongside the police. Xia Shen's parents, noticing something was amiss, hurried over to confront him, only to run straight into a group of officers. The leading officer showed his badge and addressed Xia Shen's father. Mr. Xia Heng, we have received reports from the public. You are suspected of hit and run and coercing someone to take the blame. Please cooperate with our investigation. The guests, unsure of what was happening, began whispering among themselves. Xia Heng's breathing grew rapid. Realizing the gravity of the situation, he turned to glare at me. Without solid evidence, the police wouldn't have acted. The dashcam footage was destroyed, and only a few people knew the truth. Xia Heng was convinced it was me. Panic surged within me, and I instinctively blurted out, "It wasn't me." The next second, Xia Shen gripped my hand tightly. He pulled me into his embrace, stepping back to avoid his father's furious slap. Xia Heng's outburst prompted the police to restrain him immediately. Xia's mother, visibly distraught, clung to an officer, repeatedly asking if there was a mistake. Only Xia Shen remained unmoved. As the police took Xia Heng away, Xia's mother grew hysterical and fainted. Xia Shen caught her and handed her over to Jiang Shi, calmly instructing them to take her to the hospital. Then he turned to Ren Anren. "Miss Ren, you've achieved what you wanted and done what you came to do.
Can you leave now?"
Ren Anren glanced at me with pity, but said nothing and walked away. I turned to Xia Shen. "What exactly are you trying to do?" He smiled and extended his hand. "Come on, today is our wedding. Everyone's waiting." I thought he was utterly unreasonable, His father was arrested, his mother had fainted, and yet he still insisted on going through with the wedding. Despite my protests, Xiaxin flipped the veil over my face, obscuring my expression, and pulled me step by step toward the stage. Someone began clapping, followed by the gentle melody of music. Colorful streamers floated down, and I heard Xiaxin's voice, filled with obsession and madness. Let's just call it the fulfillment of one impossible dream. The truth behind the car accident 5 years ago was finally exposed. Mr. Xie was sent to prison, awaiting sentencing, and the Xie Group's stock plummeted. Xiaxin was overwhelmed with managing the company's crisis and tasked Jiangxi with escorting me away.
But I wanted to see Xiaxin one last time.
Jiangxi had no choice. When I refused to leave and he couldn't reach Xiaxin, he reluctantly took me to Xie Group's headquarters. Xiaxin had shielded me well. There was no trace of me online. Outside the Xie Group building, however, reporters had gathered en masse, waiting to interview him. It was my first time at the Xie Group building, but thankfully Jiangxi led me through a private passage, and we quickly reached the top floor. As the elevator doors opened, 2 of Xiaxin's other assistants approached and whispered, "President Xie has a guest." Jiangxi had been with Xiaxin since my college graduation. He knew all about the entanglements between us. Without saying a word, he signaled to the assistants, and the 3 of them stepped aside. I walked up to the door of Xiaxin's office and peered through the gap. Inside, I saw Ren Anren. "You could have turned the tables on me, accusing me of stealing your company's secrets," she said, her tone filled with confusion. Xiaxin chuckled. "Secrets? If they were truly confidential, you wouldn't have obtained them so easily." In that moment, both Ren Anren and I understood. The evidence that incriminated Mr. Xie was from the car's dashcam footage. I had thought it had been destroyed long ago by Xiaxin, but to my surprise, he had kept it. I had assumed Ren Anren, with her far-reaching connections, had uncovered the evidence. But it turned out Xiaxin had leaked it on purpose.
Why?
Why, Xiaxin? Why would you do this? Inside the room, Ren Anren voiced the question that echoed in my heart. He gave me life and raised me. He is my biological father. He helped Xingran and Uncle Su, almost like a second parent to them. For the past 5 years, we've known the truth, but we couldn't do anything, didn't dare to do anything. You are Lu Xinian's widow. For you to be the one to reveal the truth. Isn't that fitting? No wonder he dismissed my repeated warnings. No wonder he remained unmoved, knowing Ren Anren had ulterior motives. It turned out he knew everything and had orchestrated the entire situation.
Ren Anren's side.
You really love Su Xingran, don't you? Hearing my name, Xiaxin looked toward the door for a moment. I thought he had noticed me, but he quickly turned away. No, I don't love her enough. If I truly loved her enough, I wouldn't have hesitated when I found the dashcam footage 5 years ago. I wouldn't have watched Uncle Su take the blame. If I truly loved her enough, I wouldn't have stood by while my father drove Uncle Su to his death and done nothing for 5 years. His voice, deep and tinged with anguish, filled the room. Ren Anren even offered him a rare moment of comfort. He is your father, after all. Xiaxin laughed bitterly. But he was also Xingran's father, her only family in this world. Every night, I dream of what might have been. If I hadn't been so selfish, so cowardly back then, if I had had the courage to expose him, wouldn't everything be different? But alas, it was too late. I crouched down, tears streaming uncontrollably. Xiaxin, this man who defied his father to protect me. This man who imprisoned me against my will, giving me every reason to hate him. This man who orchestrated his father's downfall for the freedom I desired. To the world, he was faithless and ungrateful, a man of cold detachment. Yet he had given all his love and tenderness to me. And he believed it wasn't enough.
Xiaxin, you fool.
I didn't open the door. As I turned to leave, Jiangxi, puzzled, called out softly, Miss Sue, let's go. I didn't look back. Xiaoshen was right. The moment my father died 5 years ago, there was no future for us. The past 5 years had been nothing but mutual torment. Let's call it a dream. And now that we've awakened, we'll go our separate ways. Jiangxi drove me to the airport. As the car started, the navigation system coincidentally announced, "Please find a suitable spot to make a U-turn and recalculate the route." Tears fell as I gazed out the window and smiled. Xiaoshen, let's both make a U-turn and live this life anew.